The story of the man who would become the scourge of God does not begin with a golden throne, but with the cold, bitter hunger of the Mongolian steppe and a crime that would stain a boy's soul forever. Before he was Genghis Khan, he was Temujin, a child born with a blood clot clenched in his tiny fist. A grim omen that the shamans whispered meant he was destined to be a warrior of unparalleled carnage. His early life was a masterclass in psychological and physical brutality. After his father, Yasuge, was poisoned by a rival tribe, Temujin's own clan abandoned his mother and siblings, leaving them to starve in the wilderness. It was in this vacuum of mercy that Temujin's humanity began to wither and harden into something indestructible. The first true glimpse of the monster within came when Temujin was still just a teenager. In a dispute over a hunting kill, he tracked his own half-brother, Bektar, and executed him with an arrow at point-blank range. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment mistake. It was a cold, calculated elimination of a perceived threat to his authority. This act of fratricide set the tone for the next 6 decades. Temujin realized early on that in the steppe, the only currency that didn't devalue was absolute power and the willingness to shed the blood of your own kin to secure it. As he rose through the tribal ranks, he didn't just defeat his enemies, he erased them. When he finally crushed the Tatars, the tribe that had murdered his father, he implemented a policy of systematic extermination that remains one of the most chilling footnotes in human history. He ordered every male Tatar taller than the linchpin of a wagon wheel to be slaughtered. He wasn't just winning a war, he was performing a biological purge, ensuring that the next generation of his enemies would never even be born. This was the birth of the Great Mongol State, a machine built on the bones of the old world, led by a man who had replaced his heart with a compass of conquest. To look at Genghis Khan is to look at a man who viewed the world not as a collection of cultures, but as a series of obstacles to be leveled. The terror of the Mongol war machine wasn't just found in their unmatched archery or their lightning-fast cavalry, but in the psychological warfare that Genghis Khan refined into a horrific art form. When the Great Khan's shadow fell upon a city, he offered a single, terrifying choice: surrender and become a servant of the empire, or resist and become a memory. For those who chose the latter, the consequences were beyond the limits of human imagination. During the invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, Genghis unleashed a level of fury that suggested he wasn't just a conqueror, but a force of nature seeking to reset the earth. In the city of Nishapur, after a Mongol prince was killed in battle, the Khan's daughter demanded vengeance. The result was the total liquidation of the population. Legend says the Mongols decapitated every living thing, men, women, children, even the cats and dogs, and piled their heads into massive, macabre pyramids in the desert as a monument to their wrath. They didn't just kill, they destroyed the environment itself, diverting rivers to wash away the ruins of cities so that no one would ever know they existed. In the city of Merv, it is estimated that over 700,000 people were slaughtered in a single week, with each Mongol soldier assigned a quota of victims to execute. To ensure no one was faking death, the soldiers would systematically slit the throats of the piles of corpses. This was industrial-scale slaughter, centuries before the invention of modern machinery. Genghis Khan realized that the most effective way to rule was to make the cost of resistance so high that the mere mention of his name would cause cities hundreds of miles away to open their gates in trembling submission. He weaponized fear, turning the vast landscapes of Central Asia into a silent graveyard where the only sound left was the wind whistling through the hollowed-out eyes of his victims. The sheer logistical genius of Genghis Khan was inseparable from his capacity for cruelty, and nowhere was this more evident than in his systematic dismantling of the Great Jin dynasty in China. This wasn't just a clash of armies. It was the collision of a nomadic predator with a sedentary civilization that thought its walls could protect it. Genghis viewed the fortified cities of China as cages for the weak, and he turned those very walls into instruments of torment. During the siege of Zhengdu, modern-day Beijing, The Mongols didn't just wait for the city to starve. They accelerated the process with a level of callousness that defies words. When they ran out of stones for their catapults, it is whispered in the darker corners of history that they began to launch the decapitated heads of the enemy's own fallen soldiers back over the walls, poisoning the morale and the water of the besieged. When they eventually breached the gates, the massacre lasted for a month. The stench of rotting corpses was so overwhelming that the streets ran slick with human fat, and the very soil was turned into a blackened, oily mire. This wasn't an outburst of rage. It was a deliberate policy of calculated destruction. Genghis understood that to rule China, he had to first break its spirit so completely that it would never dare to rise again. He utilized human shields with terrifying efficiency, forcing the captured civilians of one city to march at the front of his army toward the next, making the defenders choose between shooting their own neighbors or being overrun by the Mongol horde. This created a psychological feedback loop of horror that paralyzed his enemies before the first arrow was even fired. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Khan's reign was his absolute control over information and life through the YAM, the world's first truly global communication network. His arrow messengers could travel hundreds of miles a day, ensuring that the Khan's will was felt in every corner of his massive domain. This network allowed him to manage an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea with the precision of a clockmaker. However, this efficiency had a dark underbelly. The Khan implemented a legal code, the Yasa, which was as rigid as the iron he forged. In the Mongol Empire, there was no room for error. A soldier who failed to pick up a dropped item for the man behind him could be executed on the spot. This absolute discipline created a society where, famously, a young woman could carry a pot of gold from one end of the empire to the other without fear of being molested, but only because the punishment for theft was so gruesome that death was often the more merciful alternative. Genghis Khan also pioneered one of the earliest forms of biological warfare. During his campaigns, if a city refused to fall, the Mongols would catapult the carcasses of plague-ridden animals, and sometimes their own soldiers who had died of disease, over the city walls. They understood that the invisible enemy of infection could do what fire and steel could not. This wasn't just a war for territory. It was a war for the very biology of the planet. By the time Genghis Khan turned his gaze back toward the west, he had rewritten the DNA of the world, leaving behind a trail of smoke and silent cities that would take centuries to rebuild. He was the architect of a new world order, but he built it using the corpses of the old world as his foundation, proving that civilization is often just a thin veneer over the primal hunger of the wolf. The death of Genghis Khan is a mystery shrouded in blood and silence, a final act of terror designed to ensure that even in his passing, he remained untouchable. In 1227, during his final campaign against the Western Shia, the Great Khan breathed his last. The exact cause remains a subject of macabre speculation. Some say he succumbed to internal injuries after a fall from his horse, while more sensational legends suggest he was castrated by a captured Tangut princess who hid a small blade within her robes to avenge her fallen people. But the true horror lies in the funeral procession itself. To keep the location of his final resting place a secret, the Mongol army escorted his body back to his homeland, and along the way, they slaughtered every living thing they encountered. Anyone who witnessed the funeral train, peasants, travelers, children, was cut down on the spot so they could not reveal the route. After the Khan was laid to rest in the forbidden depths of the Burkhan Khaldun Mountains, the soldiers who buried him were themselves executed by another group of soldiers, who were then, in turn, slaughtered by a third group. To finish the erasure, legend says 1,000 horses were driven over the gravesite until the earth was as flat as the surrounding steppe, and a river was diverted to flow over the spot, drowning the secret forever. Genghis Khan didn't just want to be dead. He wanted to be erased from the physical world while his legend continued to haunt it. But while his grave remained a void, His biological impact on the human race became an inescapable reality. Genghis Khan was perhaps the most successful reproductive conqueror in history. Wherever the Mongols rode, the systematic rape and concubinage of the local populations followed. This wasn't just a byproduct of war. It was a reward for his commanders and a way to cement his lineage across the globe. Modern genetic studies have revealed a staggering statistic. Approximately 1 in 200 men alive today, roughly 16 million people, are direct patrilineal descendants of Genghis Khan. His DNA is a ghost that haunts the genetic code of humanity, a permanent mark left by a man who treated the world's women as spoils of war. He literally reshaped the human race in his own image, ensuring that even if his tomb was never found, his blood would flow through the veins of millions for eternity. This is the ultimate dark legacy. Not just the cities burned, or the heads piled high, but a forced genetic conquest that turned his survivors into the carriers of his name. Beyond the blood, we must look at the environmental impact of his massacres. Scientists have noted that the Mongol conquests actually cooled the planet. By slaughtering an estimated 40 million people, nearly 10% of the world's population at the time, Genghis Khan caused vast areas of cultivated land to revert to forest. This massive reforestation scrubbed nearly 700 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere. He is, quite literally, the only person in history to have cleansed the earth through genocide. It is a chilling irony that the man who brought so much fire and death inadvertently gave the planet a chance to breathe by silencing the humans who were tilling it. We are left with the image of a man who was less a human being and more a biological reset button. He broke the back of the Islamic Golden Age, shattered the Chinese dynasties, and terrified Europe to its core, all while maintaining a personal code of loyalty that rewarded merit and punished betrayal with the stake. He was a paradox, a man who created the first postal system and protected religious freedom, yet did so over the bodies of millions. As we look at the maps of the modern world, we are looking at the scars he left behind. The borders of nations, the languages we speak, and the very DNA in our cells are all echoes of a nomadic boy who decided that the only way to never be hungry again was to own everything the sun touched. To truly understand the shadow Genghis Khan cast over the world, we must look at the Pax Mongolica, the terrifying peace that followed the total exhaustion of his enemies. It was a peace built not on consensus, but on the absolute absence of anyone left to fight. The Mongol Empire became a massive continental-scale bypass for trade and ideas, but the toll for using that road was paid in the complete erasure of entire cultures. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, a continuation of the strategy Genghis perfected, they didn't just kill the caliph by rolling him in a rug and trampling him with horses to avoid spilling royal blood on the earth. They destroyed the House of Wisdom. They threw so many books into the Tigris River that it was said the waters ran black with ink, and then red with the blood of scientists and poets. This was the dark side of the Mongol legacy, the Great Reset that didn't just kill people, but deleted centuries of accumulated human knowledge. Genghis Khan believed that the greatest happiness is to scatter your enemy, to drive him before you, to see his cities reduced to ashes, to see those who love him shrouded in tears, and to gather to your bosom his wives and daughters. This wasn't a quote from a villain in a script. It was his actual philosophy. He saw the sedentary world, the world of cities, libraries, and farms, as a weakness to be harvested. The horror of Genghis Khan is that he was a genius who lacked the filter of empathy. He implemented a meritocracy where a commoner could rise to be a general. Yet he would use that same general to oversee the execution of an entire province. He was a man of his word, but his word was often a death sentence. We are forced to grapple with the fact that the modern, interconnected world we live in, the global village, found its first brutal architect in a man who used the screams of the dying as his mortar. He broke the world so thoroughly that it had no choice but to grow back together in a new shape. The Silk Road flourished under the Mongol bow, but it also became the highway for the Black Death, which followed the trade routes the Mongols secured, killing millions more than the Khan's blades ever could. It is as if the trauma he inflicted on the earth manifested as a literal plague. Even today, the scars are visible from space. The lack of ancient ruins in certain parts of Central Asia isn't due to the passage of time, but because Genghis Khan's scorched earth was so literal that he left nothing for the sand to cover. As we conclude this descent into the life of the Great Khan, we are left with a terrifying realization about human history. We often want to believe that progress is driven by the light of reason and the warmth of cooperation. But Genghis Khan is the cold, hard proof that history can also be forged by a single, unyielding will in the dark. He was a man who rose from the lowest point of human existence, a starving, abandoned child, to become the most powerful individual to ever walk the earth. And he did it by becoming the very thing he feared. He didn't just conquer the world. He broke it and rebuilt it in a way that made sure his blood would never be forgotten. He is the ghost in our DNA, the architect of our trade routes, and the silent shadow over every empty city in the steppe. He was the great Khan, the king of kings, and the man who proved that if you are willing to be monstrous enough, you can live forever in the nightmares of 1,000 generations. The wolf of the steppe may be buried in a hidden grave, but the world he created is the one we are still living in today. The final testament of Genghis Khan's reign isn't found in a monument of stone or a grand cathedral, but in the silence that followed his horsemen. We have to confront the uncomfortable truth that he was the ultimate auditor of human civilization. He looked at the world of the 13th century and found it cluttered with corruption, weak walls, and divided loyalties. And he decided to burn it all down to see what was strong enough to survive the fire. This is the Mongol paradox. He was a man who practiced religious tolerance in an age of crusades, who elevated the poor based on their skill rather than their birth, and who created a legal system that was remarkably fair for its time. Yet he achieved all of this through a level of carnage that would make a modern dictator tremble. He believed that he was the flail of God, a divine punishment sent to scourge the earth of its sins. To him, the massacres weren't an indulgence, they were a function. If a city resisted, it was a sin against the natural order of his strength, and the punishment for that sin was total erasure. He once told a captured nobleman, "If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." This psychological certainty made him impossible to stop. He wasn't just fighting for land. He was fulfilling what he believed was a cosmic mandate to bring the entire world under one sun, one Khan. As the centuries have passed, the blood has dried, and the pyramids of skulls have crumbled into dust. But the echo of his hoofbeats remains the loudest sound in the history of the East. We are still living in the aftermath of Genghis Khan. The rise of Moscow as a power center was a direct result of the Mongol yoke. The borders of Iran, the structure of China, and the cultural bridge between Europe and Asia were all shaped by his sword. But perhaps the most haunting fact is that we still don't know who he really was. We have the chronicles of his enemies and the secret history written by his followers, but the man himself remains as elusive as the wind on the Mongolian plateau. He was a man who lived his life in the open air, yet died surrounded by secrets. He was a man who fathered thousands, yet left no image of himself that we can verify. He is a ghost that haunts the entire Eurasian landmass, a reminder that civilization is a fragile thing, a series of sandcastles that can be leveled in a single generation by a man who refuses to accept the word no. When you look out over the vast, empty stretches of the steppe today, it's easy to think of him as a relic of a primitive past. But the lessons of Genghis Khan are more relevant than ever. He showed us that the world can be unified, but the price of that unity is often the soul of the world itself. He showed us that information is the greatest weapon, and that fear is the most durable form of government. He was the architect of the first truly globalized world, but he drew his blueprints in the blood of 40 million people. As we close this chapter on the Great Khan, we are left to wonder, was he a monster who set humanity back by centuries? Or was he the brutal midwife of the modern world, forcing a fractured planet to finally meet itself? Perhaps he was both. He was Temujin, the boy who killed his brother for a fish. He was Genghis, the man who killed millions for an empire. And he is the ancestor who lives on in our very cells. The Great Khan hasn't gone anywhere. He is woven into the fabric of who we are, a permanent shadow at the edge of the human story, reminding us that the dragon doesn't just live in myths. Sometimes, it rides a horse and it carries a bow. The shadow of the Khan did not dissipate with his death. It darkened and morphed into a legacy of terror that his successors, the Golden Family, would wield like a poisoned chalice. To understand the full weight of the Mongol horror, we have to look at the inheritance of the sword. Genghis didn't just leave behind land. He left behind a manual for planetary subjugation. His grandsons, like Hulagu and Batu, didn't just follow in his footsteps. They tried to outdo the grandfather of blood. When the Mongols turned their gaze toward Europe, they weren't just an army. They were a demographic apocalypse. At the Battle of Legnica, the Mongols defeated the combined chivalry of Europe and filled 9 large sacks with the ears of the fallen knights. This wasn't just trophy hunting. It was the Mongol way of bookkeeping, a grisly audit of death. They treated the entire continent of Europe like a giant hunting ground, utilizing the nerj, a massive coordinated hunting circle used to trap animals, but applying it to human populations. They would drive tens of thousands of people into a central killing zone, narrowing the circle over weeks until the prey, the men, women, and children of entire provinces, was concentrated and ready for the final, systematic slaughter. This was the terrifying perfection of the Mongol hunt. They saw no difference between a wolf and a villager. This brings us to the most chilling realization of the Genghis legacy, the sheer indifference of his power. Most conquerors in history wanted to be loved, or at least understood. Genghis and his line didn't care. They viewed themselves as the inevitable will of the eternal blue sky. If you died, it was because you were destined to die. If they conquered, it was because it was preordained. This lack of human ego made them far more dangerous than any tyrant driven by mere vanity. They didn't want to convert you to their religion. They didn't even care if you spoke their language. They simply wanted your resources, your labor, and your absolute submission. If you provided those, you might live in a state of Mongol peace, where the laws were so strict that a man could leave a bag of jewels on the road and find it there the next day. But that peace was the peace of the graveyard. It was a world where human life had been devalued to the point of being a mere statistic in the Khan's great ledger. We are talking about a regime that during the siege of Kaffa took the bodies of their own men who had died of the Black Death and used catapults to launch them into the city, effectively triggering the pandemic that would wipe out a third of Europe. Genghis Khan's legacy was the first globalized disaster, a chain reaction of fire, plague, and steel that proved just how interconnected and how fragile the human race truly is. As we look at the ruins of the civilizations he touched, the shattered irrigation systems of Mesopotamia that never recovered, the hollowed-out cities of the Silk Road, the truncated dynasties of the East, we realize that Genghis Khan was the ultimate great filter. He was the test that the world failed. He represents the moment when the primitive, raw power of the nomad overwhelmed the sophisticated, fragile systems of the settled world. And yet, we cannot look away. We are fascinated by him because he represents the absolute limit of human potential, stripped of all morality. He is the answer to the question, what could one person achieve if they were truly, completely unafraid to be a monster? The answer is that they could change the weather, rewrite the DNA of the species, and silence the world for 100 years. As the dust of the steppe settles over his hidden, river-drowned grave, we are left with the cold comfort that such a man only comes once in a millennium. But the blueprint he left behind, the use of mass terror, the weaponization of information, and the total mobilization of a society for war, is still sitting on the desk of every power-hungry soul who dreams of greatness. The great Khan is dead, but the Khanate of the mind is still very much alive. We live in a world he broke, and in the cracks of that broken world, his shadow still grows. History is rarely a record of facts. It is a graveyard of reputations managed by the victors, a collection of curated shadows designed to frighten the living into submission. Among these shadows, none loom larger or more crimson than that of Countess Elizabeth Bathory de Exed. For 4 centuries, we have been fed a diet of iron maidens and sanguine baths, a narrative of a woman so obsessed with the preservation of her own fleeting youth that she turned her ancestral home into a literal slaughterhouse. We are told she was the Blood Countess, a monster who drained the life force of 600 virgins, a creature that makes Vlad the Impaler look like a mere amateur in the arts of cruelty. But if we peel back the layers of 17th century propaganda and look at the cold, hard geometry of the world she actually inhabited, the monster begins to dissolve, replaced by something far more terrifying: a woman of immense power, intelligence, and wealth, trapped in a political ecosystem that could only survive by consuming her. To understand the truth about Elizabeth Bathory, we must first accept that the woman we think we know is a ghost story written by the very men who stole her lands and silenced her voice. We are looking at a period where the line between the occult and the medical was blurred, where the screams of the peasantry were often unheard, but where the debts of a king were loud enough to move mountains. The legend suggests a sudden descent into madness, a vanity so profound it broke the laws of nature. They say she struck a servant girl, and seeing a drop of blood land on her hand, believed her skin had become instantly rejuvenated, a moment of dark alchemy that sparked a decade of systematic murder. It is a cinematic image, haunting and visceral, but it ignores the reality of Elizabeth's lineage. The Bathorys were not just any noble family. They were the architects of Transylvanian and Hungarian history, a bloodline that boasted kings, princes, and warriors. Elizabeth herself was highly educated, fluent in multiple languages, and held more land and influence than many of the men who eventually sat in judgment of her. When her husband, the Black Knight, Ferenc Nadasdy, died, she didn't just inherit his grief, she inherited his strategic importance. She was a creditor to the crown. King Matthias II owed her an astronomical sum of money, a debt he had no intention of paying. In the feudal calculus of the 1600s, there were only 2 ways to handle a debt to a powerful widow. You could pay her, or you could erase her. By transforming a powerful political adversary into a supernatural deviant, the state achieved a total victory. They seized her estates, neutralized her family's influence, and ensured that no one would ever dare speak in her defense for fear of being tainted by her evil. As we look deeper into the transcripts of her trial, a trial where she was never allowed to testify, where the witnesses were tortured into providing the most lurid details imaginable, the cracks in the myth begin to widen. We see a woman who was perhaps stern, perhaps even cruel by modern standards, but a woman who was primarily a victim of a coordinated character assassination. The stories of her bathing in blood didn't even appear until nearly 100 years after her death, a Gothic embellishment added by a Jesuit priest to spice up a historical chronicle. Before that, the accusations were focused on simple, albeit brutal, physical abuse, something that was, tragically, not uncommon among the aristocracy of the time. But cruel mistress doesn't sell books, and it doesn't justify the permanent imprisonment of a countess in her own castle. To truly destroy Elizabeth Bathory, they had to turn her into a myth. They had to make her so repulsive that her very name became a curse. We have to ask ourselves, are we studying the life of a serial killer? Or are we studying the first and most successful smear campaign in European history? The investigation into the crimes of Szejda Castle was never a pursuit of justice. It was a surgical strike executed with the cold precision of a coup d'état. Enter Count György Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, a man who functioned as both Elizabeth's cousin and her primary investigator, a conflict of interest that in any other century would have rendered the entire case a farce. Thurzo did not approach the castle with a warrant. He arrived with an agenda. The crown was hemorrhaging gold. The Ottoman threat was pressing against the borders. And here sat a woman who held the deeds to a massive portion of the kingdom's strategic defense. The narrative of her discovery is draped in the theatrical. Thurzo claimed to have walked into the castle on a cold December night in 1610 to find Elizabeth caught in the act, surrounded by the mangled bodies of girls. Yet the legal documents tell a far more sterilized and suspicious story. There were no immediate reports, no public outcry from the nobility until the moment the state decided it was time to move. The investigation relied almost entirely on the testimony of Elizabeth's servants, Dorothea Kanisai, Ilona Jo, and Janos Uivari, who were subjected to the extraordinary interrogation techniques of the era. In the flickering light of the torture chamber, under the weight of the rack and the searing heat of the iron, these servants confessed to things that defied the laws of biology and logic. They spoke of hundreds of victims, yet when search parties scoured the grounds, they found only a handful of bodies, hardly the industrial-scale slaughterhouse the legend demands. The sheer logistics of the blood countess myth begin to crumble under the slightest pressure of common sense. To bathe in the blood of 600 virgins, as the later chronicles claim, would require a literal river of gore. Blood coagulates almost instantly upon leaving the body. It becomes a thick, unusable sludge within minutes. The idea of a warm, liquid bath of human essence is a physical impossibility, a poetic flourish added by later writers to satisfy a growing European appetite for the macabre. Furthermore, Elizabeth lived in a world of constant surveillance. A castle is not a vacuum. It is a hive of hundreds of servants, guards, messengers, and visiting nobles. To vanish hundreds of young women, many of whom were the daughters of the lower gentry, not just nameless peasants, would have caused a political firestorm long before Thurzo ever knocked on her door. The victims were allegedly sent to her for an education in courtly manners, a common practice of the time. If these girls had been disappearing by the dozen, the noble families of Hungary would have been at the gates with torches within months. Instead, we see a silence that lasted decades, broken only when the king's debt became unmanageable. It wasn't the smell of death that brought the investigators. It was the smell of insolvency. We must also consider the psychological climate of the 17th century, a time when the maleficium, the belief in inherent evil and witchcraft, was a convenient legal tool to bypass traditional rights of nobility. Elizabeth was a woman who practiced traditional medicine, who managed her estates with an iron fist while her husband was away at war, and who refused to bow to the rising clerical authorities of the Habsburg court. In the eyes of the patriarchy, an independent, wealthy, and intellectually superior woman was already halfway to being a monster. By accusing her of blood magic and sadism, her enemies didn't just take her land, they stripped her of her humanity. They ensured that her children would be shamed into silence, and that her lineage would be forever tainted. The trial was a masterclass in gaslighting. Elizabeth herself was never permitted to speak a single word in her own defense. She was walled up in a room in Sejta Castle, denied the right to face her accusers, denied the right to a legal counsel, and left to rot in darkness while the world outside systematically dismantled her life. She was the most powerful woman in Hungary, and yet, in the eyes of the law, she was treated with less dignity than a common thief. This wasn't a trial, it was an erasure. The legend of Elizabeth Bathory reached its apex with the invention of the Iron Maiden, a hollow, spiked sarcophagus designed to drain its victim slowly, a centerpiece of the Blood Countess's alleged torture chamber. Yet, archival history tells a different story. The Iron Maiden is a 19th century fabrication, a piece of dark tourism designed to thrill museum goers long after Elizabeth was in the ground. There is no mention of such a device in the contemporary trial records. No physical evidence that it ever existed in Said Castle. It is a metaphor for our own desire to see her as a mechanical monster rather than a human being caught in a political vice. By the time the rumors of the Iron Maiden and the Crimson Baths were being solidified in the public consciousness, the real Elizabeth had already been dead for centuries. Her true character buried under layers of Gothic fiction. The reality of her final years was far more mundane and far more agonizing. She was not executed, a testament to the fact that her accusers feared her family's remaining influence, but was instead sentenced to a perpetual imprisonment within the walls of her own home. Legend says she was walled into a windowless room, with only small slits for air and food, a living ghost haunting the stones of Chaita. This isolation was the ultimate weapon of the Habsburg-led conspiracy. By keeping her alive but silenced, they prevented her from becoming a martyr, while simultaneously ensuring she could never contest the seizure of her properties. For 4 years, she paced the confines of her stone cell, a woman who had once commanded armies and managed vast agricultural empires now reduced to a shadow. During this time, the investigation continued to bloat, with more and more outrageous claims being added to the record to justify her continued detention. The number of victims grew exponentially in the retelling, shifting from dozens to hundreds, as the Crown realized that the more horrific the crime, the less likely anyone would question the legality of her imprisonment. It was a psychological execution. She was robbed of light, of conversation, and of the very dignity of her rank. When she finally died in August 1614, she was found lying face down on the floor, a disgraced noblewoman whose death brought a collective sigh of relief to the Hungarian treasury. The debt was gone, the land was redistributed, the Blood Countess was born, and the wealthy widow was finally erased. But the most chilling aspect of the Elizabeth Bathory story isn't the possibility that she was a serial killer. It is the realization of how easily a powerful woman's legacy can be weaponized against her. If we look at the political landscape of the time, we see a pattern of witch-hunting the elite. The charges of vampirism and bloodletting were not just accusations of murder. They were accusations of spiritual corruption that allowed the church and the state to bypass the Golden Bull, the Hungarian constitution that protected noble rights. By branding her a monster, they placed her outside the protection of the law. Even her own sons-in-law were complicit, eager to divide the spoils of her massive estate, rather than fight a losing battle against the Palatine. Elizabeth was a sacrifice on the altar of the emerging modern state, a warning to any noble who dared to hold too much power or too much debt over the crown. She was the perfect villain for an age of transition, a woman who could be painted as both a relic of feudal cruelty and a practitioner of forbidden ancient arts. The truth is likely somewhere in the gray. A woman of her time who may have been harsh to her subordinates, but who was ultimately destroyed, not for her sins, but for her assets. The transition from historical figure to cultural icon is where the tragedy of Elizabeth Bathory takes its most cynical turn. Once the breath left her body in the darkness of Chaita, the woman ceased to exist, and the product began its eternal life. She became the ultimate prototype for the female predator, a vessel into which every era poured its own specific anxieties about female aging, power, and autonomy. In the centuries that followed, the Blood Countess became a staple of Gothic literature, her story merging with the burgeoning vampire myths of the East, eventually influencing the very architects of the horror genre. Bram Stoker's Dracula owes a silent debt to the distorted shadow of Elizabeth. She provided the blueprint for the aristocratic vampire, the predator who hides behind a veneer of refinement and ancient lineage. We see her in every modern trope of the woman who would kill to stay young, the obsession with the fountain of youth reimagined as a literal bath of gore. But this pop culture fascination is a double-edged sword. Every time we consume a film, a book, or a game featuring a fictionalized Bathory, we are participating in the final stage of the 1610 conspiracy. We are choosing the entertaining lie over the uncomfortable bureaucratic truth. We are validating a 400-year-old smear campaign because the monster is simply more interesting than the victim of a land grab. When we weigh the evidence today, we are forced to confront a disturbing lack of forensic reality. Not a single autopsy was performed. Not a single drop of blood was found in the supposed bathing rooms. The thousands of pages of testimony are filled with contradictions, hearsay, and the desperate ramblings of servants who knew that their only hope of a quick death was to provide the most sensational stories their interrogators desired. The math of her crimes simply does not add up. If Elizabeth Bathory were truly the most prolific female serial killer in history, she would have had to kill one girl every few days for 20 years without a single parent, priest, or local official raising a formal alarm until it was politically convenient for the king. It is far more likely that Elizabeth was a woman of her era, harsh, perhaps even brutal in her discipline, as was common among the high nobility who viewed their serfs as property. But she was no vampire. She was a landowner in a time of war, a widow in a time of vultures, and a creditor in a time of royal bankruptcy. Her real crime wasn't her cruelty. It was her independence. She occupied a space that the men of the 17th century believed should only belong to them. And she held a price tag that the crown could only pay in blood. The legacy of Elizabeth Bathory serves as a grim reminder of how easily history can be hijacked by those who hold the pen. She is the patron saint of the silenced, a testament to the fact that once the state decides you are a monster, the truth no longer matters. We live in a world that still loves to tear down powerful women, that still obsesses over the decay of the female body, and that still finds it easier to believe in a supernatural villain than a systemic conspiracy. To look at Elizabeth and see only the blood is to fail the test of history. We must look at the ledgers, the land deeds, and the empty pockets of King Matthias. The truth about Elizabeth Bathory isn't found in a basin of red liquid. It is found in the cold, dry ink of a debt that was never paid. She was not a monster who hunted the innocent. She was the prey of a much larger, much more sophisticated beast, the state itself. Her story is not a horror movie. It is a political thriller that ended in a tomb, leaving us with a ghost that we refuse to let rest because we are too afraid to admit that the real monsters of history don't have fangs. They have seals, signatures, and a desperate need for someone else's gold. In the final analysis, the story of Elizabeth Bathory is not a study of a deviant psyche, but a masterclass in the permanence of the lie. We have reached a point where the blood countess is more real to the collective consciousness than the woman who actually breathed, thought, and suffered within the walls of Cheta. This is the ultimate triumph of her enemies. They didn't just kill her, they replaced her. They took a complex, perhaps flawed, but undeniably powerful human being and transformed her into a cautionary tale, a grotesque caricature used to frighten children and satisfy the morbid curiosity of the masses. The tragedy is that we, the modern audience, are the accomplices in this ongoing character assassination. We prefer the version of Elizabeth who stalks the corridors of a dark castle with a blade in hand, because that version fits neatly into our archetypes of evil. To accept her as a victim of political machinations is to accept a far more boring and far more cynical reality, that history is often nothing more than a series of successful heists perpetrated by those in power. But if we look closely at the ruins of her reputation, we find a mirror reflecting our own societal obsessions. The myth of the Blood Countess thrives because it touches upon our deepest fears: the loss of youth, the corruption of nobility, and the terror of a woman who possesses both the means and the will to act outside of patriarchal control. Elizabeth was the perfect target because she was other. A woman who stayed in power too long, who owned too much, and who knew too many secrets of the court. By turning her into a vampire before the term was even popularized, her contemporaries managed to exile her from the human race. They ensured that no one would look at her life and see a mother, a widow, or a stateswoman. They would only see the red mist of their own invention. The iron bars of her cell were not just made of metal. They were forged from the ink of false testimonies and the silence of a family that chose survival over loyalty. Her death was not the end of her sentence. It was the beginning of an eternal imprisonment in the annals of horror. So, when we speak her name, we must decide which Elizabeth we are talking about. Are we talking about the ghost, the cinematic monster, the Countess of Gore? Or are we talking about the woman who was systematically stripped of her rights, her property, and her humanity to save a king from his own debts? To seek the truth about Elizabeth Bathory is to perform an act of historical justice, a late and lonely defense for a woman who was never allowed to defend herself. It is a reminder that the loudest stories are rarely the truest ones, and that the monsters we fear the most are often the ones we created to hide our own crimes. She remains walled up, not in a room in Slovakia, but in a prison of myth, waiting for a generation that values the cold evidence of the ledger over the sensational heat of the legend. Until then, she will remain the Blood Countess, a dark star in our cultural firmament, forever bleeding for a debt that was settled 4 centuries ago in the shadows of a dying Renaissance. The true horror isn't what she did to those girls. It's what we and history have done to her. This deep dive into the blood-soaked corridors of Shade Castle brings us to a final, chilling realization. The story of Elizabeth Bathory is the ultimate warning about the fragility of truth in the face of power. We have spent centuries peering into the darkness she supposedly inhabited, but perhaps it's time to turn the light back on ourselves. Why are we so eager to believe in the monster? Because if Elizabeth Bathory was a vampire, then the world makes sense. Evil is a localized physical thing that can be walled up and forgotten. But if she was innocent, or even just a victim of a coordinated state robbery, then the world is a much more terrifying place. It means that any one of us, regardless of our status or our strength, can be rewritten, erased, and demonized if we happen to stand in the path of those who own the narrative. The Blood Countess is a masterpiece of historical fiction that became a reality through sheer repetition. A ghost story that we keep telling because we are terrified of the silence that would follow if we admitted we were wrong. As we look one last time at the scattered ruins of her legacy, we see the blueprint for every modern propaganda campaign. The methodology hasn't changed, only the tools have. Character assassination, the weaponization of social taboos, the use of coerced testimony, and the strategic seizure of assets. These are the pillars upon which the legend of the monster was built. Elizabeth Bathory was the first major casualty of the information age before the age even began. She was a woman whose reality was overwritten by a viral lie, a lie so potent it survived the collapse of empires and the birth of modern science. Her name has become a brand, her life a genre, and her suffering a source of entertainment. We have turned a woman's life into a theme park of the macabre, and in doing so, we have buried the truth deeper than any stone wall could ever reach. The true blood on the hands of the Hungarian crown wasn't the blood of virgins. It was the metaphorical blood of a woman who was legally and socially murdered long before her heart stopped beating. Every time a historian repeats the unverified claim of the 650 victims, a number that only appeared in the records years after the fact, they are pulling another stone from the wall of her cell to throw at her memory. We are left with a choice. We can continue to feast on the gothic fantasy of the vampire countess, or we can honor the terrifying reality of the woman who was sacrificed for a king's ransom. History is not a mirror. It is a lens. And for too long, we have been looking through a lens stained red by the very people who wanted Elizabeth Bathory to disappear. It is time to wipe the glass clean. It is time to recognize that the most dangerous thing about the Blood Countess wasn't her cruelty, but the fact that she was a woman who knew the price of a crown and was forced to pay it with her soul. The story of Joan of Arc is often painted in the shimmering gold of cathedral altars and the soft whites of divine purity, a simplified portrait of a peasant girl who heard the whispers of angels and saved a kingdom. But to truly understand the Maid of Orleans, we must step out of the hagiography and into the thick, metallic scent of 15th century mud and blood. We must confront a figure who was not merely a passive vessel for the divine, but a woman of terrifying resolve and a surprisingly dark, singular focus. The truth about Joan is far more uncomfortable than the myth of the porcelain saint. She was a teenager who emerged from the periphery of a fractured France, not with a message of peace, but with a sword and an uncompromising demand for total war. There is a visceral, almost frightening intensity to her rise. A girl who convinced battle-hardened mercenaries and cynical princes to follow her into the jaws of a theological and political meat grinder. To look at Joan is to look at a paradox, a symbol of ultimate valor who operated with a grim, apocalyptic urgency, believing she was the finger of God directed at the throat of the English. She wasn't just a mascot for the Valois. She was a military commander who advocated for aggressive, high-casualty frontal assaults when the veteran generals preached caution. Her valor was not a quiet internal strength. It was a loud, demanding, and often bloody manifestation of a conviction that bordered on the fanatical. When we peel back the layers of Victorian sanitization, we find a Joan who was intimately acquainted with the visceral reality of the siege. A woman who wept over the souls of her enemies while simultaneously ordering the charges that would send them to their graves. This is the duality of the Maid, the blinding light of her courage casting a shadow of absolute, uncompromising war. The darkness of Joan's nature is not found in malice, but in the absolute certainty that she was the arbiter of God's will on earth, a belief that made her both invincible and incredibly dangerous to the status quo. In the medieval mind, there was no greater terror than someone who claimed a direct line to the Creator, bypassing the Holy Mother Church and the feudal hierarchy. Joan didn't just hear voices. She acted upon them with a cold, tactical efficiency that stunned her contemporaries. She was known to be relentless, possessing a temperament that could shift from ecstatic prayer to a biting, soldierly fury in an instant. There is a recorded instance where she chased camp followers away with the flat of her sword, breaking the weapon in her zeal to maintain the moral purity of her army. This wasn't just good behavior. It was the enforcement of a holy crusade where the stakes were nothing less than the soul of France. Her noblesse, her nobility of spirit, was forged in the fires of a country that had been tearing itself apart for 100 years. She stepped into a vacuum of leadership and filled it with a terrifyingly pure vision of victory at any cost. She was a master of psychological warfare before the term existed, using her banner, her short-cropped hair, and her mail armor not as a costume, but as a psychological weapon to shatter English morale. The English didn't see a saint. They saw a pucelle of the devil, a witch whose presence on the battlefield felt like a supernatural curse. And in a way, she leaned into that darkness. She didn't shy away from the carnage of the Tourelle or the blood-soaked ramparts of Orléans. She was the first on the scaling ladders and the last to leave the field, carrying an arrow in her shoulder like a badge of divine endurance. Her valor was a dark flame, beautiful to her allies and incinerating to her foes, a reminder that the most powerful force in history isn't an army, but a single, unshakable idea housed in a human heart that refuses to break. To understand the grim reality of her mission, one must look at the sheer isolation of her position. Joan was a girl of 19, surrounded by men who either wanted to use her as a tool or burn her as a heretic. The court of Charles VII was a den of vipers, and Joan was the uncomfortable truth they couldn't ignore. Her darkness was the clarity she brought to a world of gray compromises. She demanded a coronation when the politicians wanted a truce. She demanded blood when the nobles wanted diplomacy. This singular focus is what made her so effective, but it's also what made her death inevitable. There is a haunting quality to her later campaigns, particularly the failed siege of Paris and her eventual capture at Compiègne. We see a Joan who is increasingly aware of her own mortality, yet she pushes forward with a grim, almost suicidal bravery. She was a woman who had seen the gentle Dauphin crowned, fulfilling her primary prophecy, yet she could not stop. The momentum of her divine mission had become a runaway train. The valor she displayed in her final months wasn't the exuberant joy of her early victories. It was the stoic, heavy courage of someone who knows the end is coming and chooses to walk toward it anyway. She was a warrior prophet who had outlived her political usefulness, becoming a liability to the very king she had made. The tragedy of Joan of Arc is that her dark intensity, the very thing that saved France, was the same trait that made her impossible to live with in a time of peace. She was a creature of the storm, and once the clouds began to part, the world had no place for a girl who spoke with the authority of the heavens and carried the stains of 100 battles on her soul. The trial of Joan of Arc remains one of the most intellectually violent episodes in the history of the Western world. A calculated, slow-motion execution, not of a body, but of a soul. To step into the courtroom at Rouen is to witness the darkness of the medieval machine grinding against the sheer, unbreakable diamond of Joan's will. This was not a trial about heresy. It was a political assassination cloaked in the robes of the Inquisition. The prosecutors, led by the careerist Pierre Cochon, weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for a loophole in her divinity. They trapped her in a room for months, a 19-year-old girl isolated from any spiritual or legal counsel, surrounded by guards who threatened her with physical violation and subjected her to a psychological bombardment that would have shattered the most seasoned philosophers. This is where we see the darker side of her valor. Not the courage of the sword, but the courage of the mind. Her responses to their traps were not just clever, they were supernatural in their precision. When they asked her if she was in a state of grace, a question designed to damn her, no matter how she answered, she bypassed the snare with a chilling clarity. If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God so keep me. In that moment, the peasant girl from Domremy became the intellectual superior of the finest minds of the University of Paris. She was fighting a war of words where the stakes were the stake. But beneath the transcripts lies a much bleaker reality, the crushing weight of her humanity under pressure. We often forget that Joan was terrified. There is a profound darkness in her moments of doubt, the instances where the silence of her voices in the stone cold of her cell felt like an abandonment by the very God she had bled for. Her valor here is stripped of its armor and its banners. It is the raw, naked bravery of a prisoner who refuses to lie even when the scent of burning wood is already in the air. The English and their Burgundian allies needed her to recant, to admit she was a fraud. Because if she was a saint, then their entire occupation of France was a sin against heaven. They attacked her identity, focusing obsessively on her male clothing, a practical necessity for a woman in a military camp and a protection against assault in prison, framing it as a monstrous violation of natural law. This obsession reveals the true fear of her accusers. They weren't afraid of her magic. They were afraid of her autonomy. They saw a woman who had bypassed every gatekeeper of the medieval world, and they had to prove she was a creature of the pit to restore the rightful order of things. The turning point, the most haunting part of her story, is her brief abjuration and her subsequent relapse. After months of torture and the sight of the executioner, Joan momentarily faltered, signing a document of renunciation in a moment of human frailty. But within days, the dark flame returned. She resumed her male dress and reaffirmed her voices, knowing with absolute certainty that doing so was a death sentence. This was her final, most potent act of valor. She chose to burn as a relapsed heretic rather than live as a lie. She reclaimed her narrative in the final hour, turning her execution into a cosmic theater. As the flames climbed the pyre in the old market of Rouen, she didn't scream for mercy from the judges. She called out to the saints. Even the English soldiers, who had come to watch a witch die, were reportedly moved to tears, with some fleeing the scene crying that they had burned a saint. The darkness of the fire was eclipsed by the light of a conviction so pure it terrified the men who lit it. Joan didn't just die. She transformed into a permanent, haunting presence in the European psyche, a reminder that you can kill the messenger, you can char the flesh, and you can throw the ashes into the Seine, but you cannot execute a truth whose time has come. Her valor was the ultimate defiance. She forced history to accept her on her own terms, leaving her enemies with the hollow victory of her death and the eternal shame of her martyrdom. The fire that consumed Joan's body was meant to be the final punctuation mark on a life of inconvenient brilliance, but instead, it served as the catalyst for a haunting that has lasted half a millennium. The rehabilitation trial that followed 25 years later was not a sudden burst of moral clarity from the Church, but a desperate political necessity for King Charles VII. To have been crowned by a burned heretic made his own throne a blasphemy. He needed Joan to be a saint not for her sake, but for his legitimacy. This is the final layer of the darkness surrounding her story. The realization that even in death, Joan was a pawn for the powerful. The testimony gathered during this second trial, from the neighbors of her childhood and the soldiers who fought by her side, reveals a woman who was intensely, almost painfully human. They spoke of a girl who loved the sound of bells, who was moved to tears by the sight of a wounded enemy, but who also possessed a gravity that silenced the lewd jests of the barracks. Her valor was a heavy burden, a mantle of responsibility she never asked for, but wore with a grim, stoic dignity that made the men around her feel small. We see a Joan who was the conscience of France, a mirror held up to a corrupt and dying age, reflecting back a purity that was too bright to be endured. This is the true darkness of Joan of Arc. She was the ultimate outsider. She was a woman in a man's war, a peasant in a noble's court, and a mystic in a lawyer's church. Her presence was a violent disruption of the natural order, a monstrous anomaly that forced the world to reckon with the possibility that God does not speak through hierarchies, but through the marginalized. Her moms and her valor are inseparable. You cannot have the girl who stood before the king at Chinon without the girl who stood before the fire at Rouen. She represents the terrifying power of the individual who refuses to be categorized. In the centuries since, we have tried to domesticate her, turning her into a nationalist icon, a feminist hero, or a stained glass figurine. But the real Joan remains elusive, standing in the shadows of history with a banner in one hand and a sword in the other, her eyes fixed on a horizon we cannot see. She reminds us that true noblesse is not inherited. It is forged in the decision to stand for something greater than oneself, even when the cost is everything. The legacy of Joan of Arc is a testament to the fact that the most noble acts are often the most maligned in their own time. Her story is a warning about the cruelty of systems and the resilience of the human spirit. She was a flicker of light in the dark ages that refused to be extinguished, a soul that was tempered in the furnace of war and purified in the fire of betrayal. When we look at Joan today, we don't just see a martyr. We see the raw potential of human conviction. We see the truth that valor is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it, the ability to look at the stake, the fire, and the hatred of the world and to say, "I would rather die than be false to what I know to be true." She remains a haunting, beautiful, and fundamentally dark figure because she challenges us to ask what we would be willing to burn for. She is the eternal maid, the warrior saint, a reminder that in the theater of history, the most powerful role is often played by the one who refuses to follow the script. Her truth is not found in the gold of her statues, but in the ash and the grit of her resolve. A story of blood, iron, and a faith so absolute it turned a peasant girl into a legend that will outlast the stars. In the final reckoning, the image of Joan of Arc must be stripped of its romantic luster to reveal the bone-deep steel of a woman who was, by all accounts, a living anomaly. We have tried to make her soft, to make her palatable, but the Joan who actually existed was a creature of sharp edges and absolute, terrifying clarity. Her valor was not a quiet virtue. It was a loud, disruptive force that demanded the world bend to her vision of the divine. There is a specific, profound darkness in the way she was consumed by her own brilliance. She was a girl who had seen the apocalypse of her country and decided with a grim and singular determination that she would be the one to stop it. This wasn't the bravery of a child. It was the calculated courage of a martyr who knew from the moment she left Domremy that the path led to a pyre. She didn't stumble into her fate. She marched toward it with her eyes open, her hand on her sword, and a heart that had already made peace with the flames. This is the truth that history often hides, that greatness is rarely kind or comfortable. It is a violent, transformative power that destroys the vessel it inhabits. Joan's dark nature was her refusal to compromise with a world that was built on nothing but compromise. She stood in the center of a century of lies and spoke a truth that was so pure it was perceived as a threat to the fabric of reality. The valor we celebrate today was, in 1431, seen as the ultimate arrogance, the audacity of a peasant to dictate to kings, and the defiance of a woman to judge the church. We love her now because she is safe, because she is a statue that cannot speak back. But if Joan were to stand among us today, she would likely be just as terrifying, just as dark, and just as monstrous to our modern sensibilities as she was to the inquisitors at Rouen. She would still be the outsider, the one who hears a higher calling that ignores the noise of the crowd. She represents the terrifying weight of absolute conviction, the kind of faith that doesn't just move mountains, but burns them to the ground to clear a path for the spirit. As the curtain falls on the life of the Maid, we are left not with a saint in a niche, but with a ghost that refuses to be quieted. Joan of Arc is the patron saint of the impossible, a reminder that the world is changed not by those who follow the rules, but by those who are brave enough to be broken by them. Her story is the ultimate tragedy and the ultimate triumph, a narrative of a girl who was traded like a commodity, judged by cowards, and killed by the small-minded, only to rise from the ashes as the eternal conscience of humanity. She is the light that shines in the dark, but she is also the darkness that reminds us of the cost of that light. To remember Joan is to recognize that true noblesse is a fire that consumes everything it touches, leaving behind only the pure, indestructible essence of what it means to be truly, fearlessly alive. She was the Maid of Orleans, the prisoner of Rouen, and the martyr of France. But above all, she was the girl who dared to believe that she was enough to change the world. And in the end, she was right. The enduring power of Joan of Arc lies in the fact that she remains a mystery that no historian, no poet, and no politician can fully solve. She is the shadow in the cathedral, the grit in the machinery of the state, and the silent scream at the heart of the 100 years of madness. When we look into the abyss of her trial, we don't see the face of a victim. We see the reflection of a world that was too small for her spirit. The darkness we attribute to her was never hers. It was the darkness of the men who couldn't understand a power that didn't come from a crown or a purse. Her valor was a mirror that revealed their cowardice, and her purity was a light that exposed their corruption. They had to extinguish her to stop looking at themselves. But in their attempt to erase her, they granted her the only thing the world cannot take back: immortality. They thought they were disposing of a girl, but they were actually planting the seeds of a legend that would grow through the cracks of every empire that tried to claim her. As we conclude this reflection, we must accept that the truth about Joan of Arc is not found in the documents of the Inquisition or the decrees of the Vatican, but in the silence of the field at Domremy and the cold stones of the tower at Rouen. She is a reminder that the most profound strength is often the most isolated. To be the Maid of Orleans was to be alone in a crowd of thousands, to be the only person in a kingdom who truly believed that things could be different. Her life was a short, sharp shock to the system of history, a reminder that the impossible is merely that which has not yet been attempted by someone with enough courage to die for it. She was the storm that cleared the air, the fire that forged a nation, and the girl who proved that heaven is not a place you go to, but a standard you bring down to earth. So, let the statues stand and the incense burn. But never forget the real Joan, The girl who felt the weight of the sword, the heat of the fire, and the crushing pressure of the world's expectations, and who stood her ground anyway. She is the patron of the defiant, the icon of the unbreakable, and the eternal proof that even the darkest night can be shattered by a single, focused ray of light. Her name is carved into the soul of France, but her spirit belongs to anyone who has ever been told that they are too small, too young, or too powerless to make a difference. Joan of Arc was not a miracle because she was a saint. She was a miracle because she was a human who refused to be anything less than divine. The fire is long gone, but the warmth of her conviction still burns across the centuries. A dark and beautiful flame that will never, ever go out. The legend of Joan of Arc concludes not with a resolution, but with a lingering, restless question that echoes through the corridors of power and the quiet corners of our own hearts. We are forced to ask, what does it say about humanity that our greatest icons of valor must first be broken on the wheel of our own collective fear? We claim to admire her now, but we are the descendants of the same culture that built her pyre. The darkness of her story is a mirror held up to our own capacity for betrayal, our tendency to deify the dead while we crucify the living who dare to possess the same uncompromising spirit. Joan was not a figure of the past. She is a recurring frequency in the human experience, a warning that the truth is often a dangerous weapon in the hands of the pure. Her noblesse was a form of violence against the status quo, a spiritual insurrection that proved one person's conviction can be more effective than 1,000 years of tradition. She was the grain of sand that seized the gears of the world, and though she was crushed, the machine was never the same again. As the embers of her memory continue to glow, we must realize that Joan's victory was not found in the liberation of Orléans or the crowning of a king. It was found in her refusal to be silenced by the fire. The English thought they were destroying a witch. The French thought they were losing a mascot. But in that moment of ultimate sacrifice, Joan became something far more potent, a permanent haunting of the human conscience. She is the shadow that falls across every courtroom where justice is traded for policy, and every battlefield where the innocent are sacrificed for the pride of the powerful. Her valor was a dark gift to the world, a reminder that the cost of changing history is usually paid in blood, and that the only thing more terrifying than a girl with a sword is a girl with a mission that she is willing to die for. She was the architect of her own martyrdom, a master of her own destiny, who chose to be a legend rather than a survivor. We leave her now where we found her, standing at the intersection of myth and reality, draped in the armor of her own making, looking out at a world that still struggles to contain her. She is the eternal maid, the warrior who never retreated, the saint who was born in a stable and died in a furnace. To speak of Joan of Arc is to speak of the limits of human endurance and the infinite reach of the human soul. She remains our most beautiful paradox, a girl of 19 who taught the world how to live with honor and how to die with dignity. The flame that took her life didn't end her journey. It simply released her into the air we breathe, a permanent spark of defiance in an age of shadows. She is Joan, the daughter of God, the terror of England, the soul of France, and the eternal proof that, even in the deepest darkness, a single heart on fire can light the way for us all. The final, most haunting truth about Joan of Arc is that her execution was not the end of her story, but the beginning of an eternal investigation into the human soul. We are still at that trial in Rouen, perpetually acting as the judges, the witnesses, or the silent, complicit crowd. Every time we confront the darkness of her fate, we are testing our own limits of belief. Could a girl from a village truly hear the voices of the heavens? Or did she simply possess a psychological intensity so profound it mimicked the divine? Perhaps the answer doesn't matter. Whether her power came from the saints or from the raw, untapped potential of the human psyche, the result was the same: a total restructuring of history. Her valor was a disruption of the laws of probability. She was a peasant who should have died in obscurity, yet she became the most documented woman of the Middle Ages. This is the ultimate darkness, The terrifying realization that the world is far more malleable than we want to believe, and that a single, determined individual can tear the fabric of reality if they are willing to be consumed by the fire of their own conviction. We look back at the scorched earth of her life and see that she was never meant to survive the peace. She was a creature of the transition, a bridge made of bone and spirit between the old world of feudal lords and the new world of nations. The tragedy of her noblesse is that she was too pure for the world she saved. She was a masterpiece of human will that the world felt compelled to destroy because it couldn't stand the comparison. Her dark nature was simply the reflection of our own inadequacies. We called her a witch because we couldn't explain her genius, and we called her a saint because we couldn't live with the guilt of her murder. She stands today as a silent sentinel over our history, a girl who refused to be small, who refused to be silent, and who refused to be forgotten. She is the reminder that the most noble thing a human being can do is to be themselves so completely that the world has no choice but to either kill them or worship them. As we turn away from the pyre and the banners, let us carry with us the weight of her resolve. Joan of Arc is the patron of the impossible, not because she performed miracles, but because she was the miracle. She was the proof that a human being, armed with nothing but a vision and the courage to act upon it, can face down the concentrated power of an empire and an entire church and emerge victorious even in death. She remains the flame that never flickers, the voice that never falters, and the spirit that refuses to be quenched. Her story is a testament to the fact that while bodies are fragile and lives are short, an idea fueled by absolute valor is immortal. Joan of Arc didn't just fight for France. She fought for the right of every soul to listen to its own voices, to follow its own path, and to burn with its own unique, dark, and beautiful. The legacy of Joan of Arc is a shadow that stretches across the centuries, growing longer as the sun sets on the age of absolute certainty. We find ourselves standing in the cold, gray dawn of a world she helped create, yet we are still no closer to touching the essence of the girl who stood in the fire. To speak of her truth is to speak of the darkness of a vision so blinding it rendered the rest of the world obsolete. She didn't just fight a war, she conducted a symphony of human will that resonated through the stones of every cathedral in Europe. Her valor was a heavy, visceral thing, a weight she carried with the stoicism of a veteran and the heartbeat of a child. When we look at the truth of Joan, we must face the terrifying possibility that she wasn't just a saint or a girl, but a force of nature, a rare atmospheric event that occurs when a human heart becomes so pressurized by conviction that it begins to generate its own gravity. She pulled the stars down to the mud of France and forced the world to look up. And for that crime of perspective, she was sacrificed. This is the ultimate closing of the ledger, the realization that the world will always fear the person who cannot be bought, cannot be reasoned with, and cannot be broken. Joan's dark nature was her absolute lack of fear in the face of the abyss. She looked at the king and saw a man. She looked at the inquisitors and saw cowards. She looked at the fire and saw a gateway. This level of autonomy is the most dangerous thing a human can possess. It is the valor that transcends the battlefield and enters the realm of the eternal. She was the first modern individual, the first person to stand before the gathered might of the old world and say, "I know who I am, and your judgment cannot reach me." That is the secret she whispered into the flames at Rouen, a secret that has been vibrating through history ever since. She left us with a blueprint for how to be free, even in a cage, how to be heard, even in a tomb, and how to be remembered, even when the world tries to turn your name into ash. As we conclude this journey into the crimson and gold of her life, we are left with a final, echoing silence. The banners have rotted, the swords have rusted, and the kingdom she saved has transformed 1,000 times over. But the maid remains. She stands at the edge of our consciousness, a girl of 19 who changed the shape of the human soul. She is the truth that survives the fire. She is the valor that outlasts the war. She is the reminder that even when the darkness is at its deepest, the most powerful weapon in the universe is a single, solitary yes to a calling that only you can hear. Her story is over, but her mission continues every time a person refuses to lie to their own conscience. Joan of Arc didn't just die for France. She died for the light in all of us that the world tries to put out. And as long as we remember her, that light will continue to burn, dark, beautiful, and absolutely, undeniably free. This has been the full, deep dive reflection on the life, the darkness, and the valor of Joan of Arc. If you've traveled this far into the fire with me, perhaps you've seen a flicker of that same resolve within yourself. History is more than just names and dates. It's a mirror. What did you see when you looked at the maid? Was she a victim, a victor, or something else entirely? Thank you for listening to this meditation on the blood and spirit of the Maid of Orleans. If this exploration of history's darker truths resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. We are all judges in the trial of history. Let us try to be more merciful than the men of 1431. Until next time, remember, the truth doesn't need a crown to be royal, and a heart on fire can never truly be extinguished. See you in the next one.